This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This episode is produced in partnership with the Jacob Robinson Institute for the History of Individual and Collective Rights at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. My guest today is a postdoctoral fellow at the Robinson Institute and a historian specializing in Zionist diplomacy in the years preceding the establishment of the State of Israel. Dr. Eran Shlomi, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thank you.
So your research focuses on Zionist diplomacy at the League of Nations, an area that has been largely overlooked by scholarship of Zionist diplomacy, that for obvious reasons focused on the great powers, chiefly Great Britain. Now, it actually makes sense since we all know that the League of Nations is and was and is still perceived as a toothless and ultimately failed organization. So why does Zionist diplomacy there even matters?
Well, the mandate for Palestine was a mandate of the League of Nations given to the British to administer Palestine, as it was for other mandates around the Middle East. There were three categories for mandates around the world. Category A was given to the British by the League of Nations and the French. Palestine with Transjordan and Iraq to the British, Syria and Lebanon to the French. Back in 1920s, it was part of the mandate system. So the Zionist organization understood back after the World War I in 1919, 1920, that the Balfour Declaration would be dependent on, in some way, dependent on the League of Nations. The sovereignty over the land of Israel, Palestine, would be the sovereignty of the League of Nations. They didn't understand exactly what it means, moral sovereignty, international sovereignty, but initially they understood that the League of Nations is going to be a player. Didn't understand what would be its role. After the Balfour Declaration was inserted into the mandate in the preamble, and then later when it ratified by the mandate was ratified at the League Council in July 1922, basically the League of Nations and international law became the protector of the Jewish national home.
So what powers did the League of Nations have over the administration of the mandate? I mean, how did the British government with respect to Palestine and the League of Nations interact in running Palestine?
So every mandatory power had to submit a report to the PMC, the Permanent Mandates Commission, which was the League's body that supervised mandatory powers. And every year, an accredited representative of mandatory powers had to show up to the PMC, in front of the PMC in Geneva, and go over the annual reports, explain policies, and basically the PMC saw themselves as the guardians of local populations, of the subjects of the mandate, local inhabitants.
And did they really have executive powers over the British, or could the British just do whatever they wanted?
So in the 1920s, while the League of Nations still had its prestige and influence, the PMC allowed itself to publish critical reports here and there, but mostly when severe political circumstances obliged them to do so. So, for example, when in 1925, when the Syrian revolt, they had the French representative in front of them, and then they had to they published reports that were critical of the French administration. Same thing happened in 1930 when, after the riots of 1929
in Palestine,
the PMC, the Permanent Mandate Commission, published harshly critical reporting against the British conduct before, during, and after the riots, which helped the Zionists eventually and the supporters of the Zionists in British Parliament to oppose the British policy in the aftermath of the riots. Specifically, the white paper that was published, that issued in October 1930, limiting almost completely Jewish immigration and land purchase.
And then the PMC said that it counters the mandate, right? And then it basically, Britain was in breach of the powers that were entrusted to it by the PMC. That's really the legal situation that was.
Yeah. So go back to your question of the teeth. It's mostly public, the public diplomacy. The reports on the minutes of the PMC were made public after the different discussions and deliberations, and then the people in Great Britain, in France, it depends on the different mandatory power, could that way it only mainly worked with democracies. The people could react to the policies and the reports and the criticism and so on.
Mm-hmm. So they didn't really have concrete legal powers. It was just one method for public debate to brew inside the British parliamentary system, or perhaps public debate.
Yeah, and that talk, this public talk, was influential mainly in 1920s, and even later on, they lost even that.
Yeah, it's interesting that emanating from your work is this realization that the League of Nations and the British policy in Palestine went in opposite directions. That the League of Nations was initially pretty cool, if not hostile, towards Zionism. Just in the beginning of the 1920s, when perhaps Britain was most pro-Zionist of the 30 years of the British Mandate, and towards the end of the 1920s, mid to end of the 1920s, the British support for Zionism started to cool off, culminating in the 1930s report, and later, of course, in towards the end of the 1930s with the White Paper. And at the same time, as of the mid to late 1920s, the League of Nations became eminently Zionist, and I think one of the it's not exactly your wording, but one of the works that you cite is that the League of Nations ventriloquized the Zionist movement at some point.
Yeah.
How did they come into play, these two, in terms of support or lack thereof for Zionism?
Well, before the mandate was ratified in 1922, it was still questionable what would be inserted into the mandate, what would be eventually ratified. And until that moment, until July 1922, there were different voices, different ideas, different perceptions. The most important article in the covenant, for that matter, for the future of the mandates, was Article 22 of the League's covenant, which meant it's the mandate system article, that the system itself is for the local population, or for the mandatory powers to administer the mandates as a tutelage for the local populations to achieve some sort of self-rule. It doesn't mention independence, but some sort of standing on their own feet. And the local population in Palestine was, the majority was Arab. So it made sense that according to Article 22, the mandate's supposed to serve the Arab inhabitants of Palestine. And then when the Balfour Declaration was inserted into the mandate, it changed the picture, because the Arabs are not mentioned in the text. They are only mentioned as non-Jewish population, as opposed to the Jewish people or the Jewish population was mentioned there, and the favorable eye of establishing a Jewish national home. So from 2022, again, this international law served as a protector for the Jewish national home. Yet, some in the PMC, not all of the League of Nations and not all of the PMC, but members of the PMC, some members understood it as a contradiction, the mandate itself and Article 22 of the Covenant, and they interpret it as Article 22 goes above everything else because of the Covenant of the League of Nations. And that changed in the mid-1920s, 1925, even to be more exact. There's a major shift. Chaim Weizmann, in actually late 1924, he comes to Geneva, accompanied Herbert Samuel, the High Commissioner of Palestine, and he wanted to explain the PMC, or to stand in front of the PMC and update them the development of the Jewish national home. And he was not allowed to go into the room when the PMC discussed
Weizmann.
Chaim Weizmann was not allowed into the room. He was not aware that there's a rule against any other visitor or any other representative who's allowed to go in as only the accredited representatives of the mandatory powers. So that was Herbert Samuel. He went in, Weizmann stayed outside, and he realized that there were other rules that he neglected, and he and the Zionist executive were not aware of. So, for example, the Zionist executive in London sent a memorandum to the PMC, again, updating the development of the Jewish national home, and it was not accepted at the PMC because there was another rule that any petition, and it was a memorandum, but it was perceived as a petition by the PMC. All petitions has to go through the mandatory administration, which means in Jerusalem in this case, and then with the response of the administration to the PMC. But Weizmann and the Zionist organization sent it directly from London to Geneva. It was not accepted. However, the Arab executive of the Arab representative of the Palestinians, Arab Palestinians in Palestine, did send their memorandum through the proper channels, which was accepted. So in late 1924, the PMC issued a critical report against the Zionist project, basically suggesting that the newcomers coming from Eastern Europe, Poland, didn't have the right training for agriculture, which was the much needed work in Palestine. And Weizmann was alarmed. Some scholars said he was hysterical, but he was afraid that the first international report on Palestine by the sovereign or moral sovereign, it was very obscure. What does it mean, the sovereign, the League of Nations role? But the first report of the PMC and the League of Nations was negative towards the precious Jewish immigrants, precious for the Zionists.
So this was the starting point of this diplomatic offensive at the PMC, with the appointment of what you call the first professional diplomats of the Zionist movement. What was their role in their? How did they do their diplomatic work?
So then Weizmann assigned Victor Jacobson, who was a veteran diplomat from before the World War I. He was a representative in Istanbul, and then a political ally of Weizmann. So Weizmann basically did two things. One is he after that critical report in late 1924, he targeted William Rappard, who was the head of the most important member of the PMC, took him, made sure he had an invitation to the inauguration of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And Rapar came here. On the way, Weizmann was on the boat with Arthur Balfour, Lord Balfour, that together they sat with Rapar and converted him into Zionism. And after the inauguration, they took him to a tour with other honored guests. And Rapar came back enamored with Zionism and Weizmann. And the two kept warm relations basically until their death. And to your question, Victor Jacobson, the diplomat who was sent to Geneva, he was actually sent to Paris and Geneva. But in Geneva, he opened an office. That was in June 1925. And hired a small staff, a limited budget. Again, the whole scene in Geneva was uncertain for the Zionists. They were not sure what is the meaning of Geneva, what they can take, but they just understood that there should be somebody who would represent the Zionist cause and will teach the Central Zionist Office and the Zionist Executive in London what's going on in Geneva, what are the rules of engaging diplomacy in Geneva, and so on. So Jacobson was mini Weizmann. He was an expert in personal diplomacy, one-on-one. He was, according to reports, a very friendly, charming person, and also public diplomacy, mainly press conferences, film evenings where he showed the films of the progress of the Zionist projects in Palestine, and they issued a monthly bulletin with information of the development of a Jewish national home. That was the
and as you say, it worked spectacularly well. That slowly, I mean, Rapar was the first one to be converted, but slowly they influenced much of the composition of the PMC and turned them, converted them, as you say, to Zionism. Was there no successful counter attack by the Palestinians, and not even the British, because it was done under the nose of the British, who knew, who had their own ideas about what's going on in Palestine at the same time?
I would say over their heads, not under the nose.
Right.
Because Weizmann had to, actually, Jacobson came to Geneva without an approval by the British, without a letter of approval by the British, and he couldn't meet anyone of importance until he had that. And Weizmann had to make sure he will have it. And eventually, the British acquiesced with the Zionist presence there. They didn't like it. Some really rejected it, but the Weizmann was there was still an alliance between the Zionists and the British, so they allowed it to exist. So there was a pushback by the British, but the Arab diplomats, especially Emir Shakib Arslan, who was a Lebanese aristocrat who lived in Geneva since the 1920s. He had his office there. In 1925, he had his office, more or less the same time when the Zionists opened their office. And he basically did the same thing. He had his own newspaper, and he met with league officials. But according to the league officials who reported on their meetings with Shakib Arslan, and also according to critics among Arab diplomats, the Arab diplomacy never was successful, especially if you compare it to Weizmann and Jacobson, and there are many reasons for it. One of them is habitus. They're very different in their culture, in ideology. The League of Nations was perceived as a new stage of colonialism, some would say. And Shakib Arslan and the other delegations who would go there are very anti-colonial, obviously. So they were speaking different languages in many ways. Some even said that the way the Arab diplomats translate their arguments doesn't come out well in English or French, which was the languages spoken in Geneva. So there were many reasons. I think the most important one is that from a legalistic point of view, the Zionists had the upper hand because the Balfour Declaration is in the mandate, and the mandate is the most important text or document to run, to overseeing Palestine. So the Zionists had advantage there, and the PMC members truly believe that the Zionist project goes hand in hand with the ideals of the League of Nations, of self-determination, and that the Jews are indigenous to Palestine, or the land of Israel.
Right. It is interesting when you think about the Zionist diplomats in Geneva and the Zionist leaders in Palestine, that they almost, operated in parallel universes. David Ben-Gurion and other people, Chaim Weizmann was perhaps the outlier here, but they were, of course, concerned with the real powers, Britain and later, great powers in the world, and never gave too much thought to what's going on in Geneva. But also, not less interestingly, Victor Jacobson himself, as you write, visited Palestine only later, towards the end of his life, and insisted to be buried in Geneva rather than in the Holy Land. Mm-hmm. And even his successor, Nachum Goldman, was this internationalist diplomat, not very, didn't care too much for what was going on in Zion. This is really interesting how, there was this group of Zionists in Geneva that seemed not to care too much for Zion.
Interesting the way you phrase this question. Well, I consider Jacobson and Goldman Zionist internationalists in the true sense of the word, because they were very Zionist. They were part and parcel of the Zionist institutions and establishment, but also working in international sphere, with international institutions, and their perception of politics was part of international of their order, which was obviously very different from labor leaders such as David Ben-Gurion and others. It goes with an understanding of Zionism from outside, and I know that for many years, historians of Zionist history were writing about Zionist history from Zion out. And in recent years, we have more and more scholars, as Moti Golani and others, who write about London. He just published his biography on Chaim Weizmann, where the focus of the story is almost completely London. Here and there, he goes to Rehovot, he visits what will be later Weizmann Institute, but the whole story, and it's a very Zionist story, it happens in London. In a way, I add to this trend and adding to London, Geneva. So it's again Zionism from the outside. The secondary political arena after London was Geneva. And Weizmann recognized it.
Yeah, Weizmann is of course the example here, but how did they, you studied these people thoroughly. How did they justify to themselves, being Zionist, but not really, being outside of the Zionist endeavor, of the construction of the national home, etc.?
Mm-hmm. To be specific about Victor Jacobson as a diplomat and as the protagonist of my research, he tried to get to Palestine a few times throughout his career. He was there in 1908 for the last time. He was born in Crimea in the Russian Empire, and then moved to Berlin. Spent a year in Italy. Went back to Simferopol, where he's from, and then he was sent to Beirut. It was 1906 to be the manager of our Zionist bank, Anglo-Palestine company, through his connections with the Russian Zionists, and then he was moved to Istanbul. So the last time he was there was actually 1908, before he moved to Istanbul, and then Berlin, London, and eventually Geneva, Paris and Geneva. Throughout his career, he pleaded his colleagues at the Zionist office in London, send me to Palestine so I can really understand what I'm talking about. So when I'm presenting Palestine, or to be more exact, the Zionist projects and enterprises in Palestine to League officials, I'll be more trustworthy and authentic because I've seen it with my own eyes. And every time he was sure he's going to be sent there, he already had plans for this tour in Palestine, something happened that required his attention, and he stayed in Paris, Geneva, Europe. Basically, he's a European man, always on the move, always on the train. And he died in the train, which is not very surprising because he was always moving around from Paris to Geneva and other places.
It was symbolic. Yeah.
Very symbolic. So eventually he got there, but with Jacobson, it was just a matter of timing, and he never managed to get there before 1973.
But also about the burial thing, that he was specifically asked to be buried in Geneva, and unlike what you'd expect of a lifelong Zionist, to be buried in Palestine.
So, yeah. So that was why Jacobson never made it to Palestine before, and it's not just because he couldn't find the right time to get there. It's something deeper than that. Yeah. It's the fact that for such men, to be more exact, mostly men, who consider themselves internationalists, they were needed in the international arena. So they could go to Palestine and visit and know the land, but their arena was Geneva when it comes to Jacobson, or Berlin, or Paris, and so on. So it's more than just where, knowing the country. It's like where they are needed or where they find political path. Back to your question about being buried in Geneva, I couldn't find anything that explains why Geneva, but I think it's because, one, that he grew up in an assimilated Jewish home. He never spoke Yiddish or Hebrew. Towards the end of his life, he read some Talmud and he improved a little bit of his Hebrew, but he was criticized by some of his colleagues that he couldn't understand problems or that every Ostjuden, Eastern European Jew, could understand, because he's not an Ostjuden Jew, he's a European man. He was versed in French culture, he spoke fluent Russian, German, Italian, Hebrew, and Yiddish not so much.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it really ties beautifully into my next question, which is about the role of Zionist diplomacy and the Jewish presence at the League of Nations in general. This wasn't just about the mandate for Palestine. It was no less than that, and perhaps even more, about the other role of the League of Nations with respect to the Jewish populations, and that was the minority treaties of the 1920s and 1930s that were supposed to protect minorities all across Europe, but chiefly Jewish ones. And later, of course, into the 1930s, they all collapsed so spectacularly. But much of the Zionist diplomacy was dedicated to promoting and safeguarding the minority rights treaties. How did the two interact? On the one hand, taking care of the Palestine mandate, and at the same time, the minority rights.
So basically, you're broadening the scope now, because Jacobson was not alone there in Geneva. When he came to Geneva, there were already other Jewish representatives, advocates, including Zionist advocates, that he had to work with in cooperation, sometimes competing with them. So there's an organization that is Jewish and Zionist called the Comité de Délégation Juif, an organization established after World War I, 1919, that was advocating for Jewish minority rights in Europe, Jewish national minority rights in Europe, collective rights. And the committee was in charge of that, and they had their representative there, a local Zionist activist named Tzvi Aberzon. And his job was to petition the League, especially the minority section, and represent different minorities at the League. when Jacobson came to Geneva, he met Zvi Abelson, and the two decided on splitting the roles and not intervening in each other's path, which happened. So Jacobson will take the work of the future, which is the Jewish national home in Palestine, and Abelson took what he already did, is just dealing with Jewish minority rights in the diaspora. And while Jacobson distrusted Abelson, he hoped they will find a modus vivendi, which was questionable. There's one example in early 1927, that Jacobson was involved in a public campaign in the League of Nations against the Romanian government in the following anti-Semitic incidents in Romania, which was ostensibly Abelson's field. But Jacobson took the lead and basically disregarded Abelson on his way there. So in his campaign. So there was supposed to be a divide, but as we understand, they were not always divided at these two paths. But in the Zionist point of view, yes, there's the work of the future and the work of the present, the protection of Jewish rights in the diaspora, called in German Gegenwartsarbeit. That was not Jacobson's field. When Nachum Goldman replaced Jacobson, he was already, in 1935, the head of the committee. So he was already in charge of representing Jewish interests and protecting the minority rights. And then he took over Jacobson's role, and in that, the two strands of Jewish advocacy were united under Nachum Goldman. He was criticized for that too, because there were many who believed that you can't petition against, let's say, the government of Poland for infringement of Jewish rights, and then ask for an interview with the Polish foreign minister to work with how do we get your Jews out and bring them to Palestine. So these two strands required, according to some of the critics, two different personalities and divided two missions.
What do you think?
What do I think?
Yeah. Who was right?
I think it was meant to be intertwined, especially when it's a Zionist organization. The Comité, which later became the World Jewish Congress, initially was a Zionist organization. There were other Jewish advocates, non-Zionists, who were advocating for individual equal rights for Jews, assimilists. So when it comes to Zionist endeavors, it was meant to be intertwined.
But were they more powerful than the non-Zionist groups? And I mean, was really the Zionist representation there the paradigm of Jewish advocacy in Geneva? Or was it just one out of many?
It was, if you take all the different organizations who worked there, I would say that Weizmann's organization was the most influential one, and had took over or took advantage of the possibilities of the League of Nations more than anyone. It's not just because of Weizmann, but also because that the mandate system and the PMC, this whole path was much more fertile for advancing Jewish and Zionist interest than the minority system that in it from the officials of the minority sections never saw to create their own PMC, or their own permanent minorities commission as the mandate system or the mandate section had. So that's one difference. But also the head of the minority section and his colleagues, they didn't wanna interfere in the sovereignty of member states. So interfering in questions of minority protection within a specific state, whether it's Poland, Romania, was considered as infringement on the sovereignty of that state, and alienating in some ways that state from League the league or from the operation of the league, and that was too complicated to do, and they just basically did not do it. So that's why the minority system failed and the mandate system succeeded, depending on who you look at.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think whether the history that you're telling here changes something of the historiography of the League of Nations, that looks at it as perhaps, a bold attempt at international diplomacy that collapsed under the weight of the challenges of the hour. And looking at it from this perspective that you offer, of the Zionist diplomacy specifically, do you think that the Zionist enterprise would have turned out differently without all these efforts in Geneva, or did they have a substantial contribution to the construction of later the State of Israel?
That's a good question, and as a historian, I cannot understand. I can suggest alternative histories. What happened if? But I do see, and it's not just me, also historians that I build on, like Susan Pedersen, that Geneva facilitated success in London. So London was the key, but Geneva was a tool to help Weizmann and Zionist supporters in parliament and so on. So it was a very powerful tool. There's an example in 1930 when the white paper, Passfield's white paper, that limited Jewish immigration and land purchase, was on debate in the parliament, and David Lloyd George, a former prime minister of Britain in the time of the Balfour Declaration, was considered pro-Zionist. He held that critical PMC report against the white paper, and used their arguments there to fight this new policy and to
pressure the government.
To pressure the Labour government, yeah. So that definitely helped. So Geneva was a powerful tool to bear pressure on the Labour government in that specific example.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is really the legacy of these diplomats for not just today, but for diplomacy later in the early years of the State of Israel? How did they influence what was perceived then as Zionist diplomacy?
Well, I definitely see them as the first professional diplomats, Victor Jacobson and Nahum Goldman, for sure. And they laid the groundwork for future diplomats.
Yeah. All right, Eran Shlomi, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.